June 323 BC. The air hangs heavy and wet, thick with incense smoke and the rot of the Euphrates at low tide. Torches line the halls of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, the same halls that once trembled under Babylonian kings, now draped in Macedonian purple. Outside, 2 million square miles of conquered earth wait in silence. Inside, a 32-year-old man is dying. He had done what no human being had ever done. He had broken Persia, swallowed Egypt, marched his army to the edge of India and back. His empire stretched like a golden serpent from the cold Aegean shore to the sun-scorched banks of the Indus, 4,000 miles of blood, brilliance, and iron will. One man, 32 years. The largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. And now, on a sweat-soaked bed in a conquered palace, surrounded by the greatest generals of the age, none of them could save him. This night did not just end a life, it ended an era. And the mystery of what happened in that room has haunted historians for over 2,000 years. To understand why Alexander's death shattered the ancient world, you must first understand what kind of man walked into that palace in Babylon and what kind of world had forged him. He was born in 356 BC in Pella, Macedonia, a kingdom that the great Greek city-states of Athens and Thebes barely considered civilized. Macedonia was rough country, mountain-hardened and war-shaped, sitting at the northern edge of the Greek world like an uninvited guest at a philosopher's dinner. His father, Philip II, had dragged that rough kingdom into something formidable, a professional army, a kingdom with ambition. But Philip was murdered in 336 BC, stabbed at his own daughter's wedding, and Alexander, 20 years old, untested, surrounded by enemies on every side, inherited the throne. He did not inherit peace. Greece immediately stirred. Thebes revolted. Neighboring kingdoms smelled weakness. The Persian Empire, the largest political structure on earth, stretching from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, ruled by Darius III from his palace at Persepolis, watched the young Macedonian king with contempt and calculation. They had all made the same mistake. We first meet Alexander not through biography, but through action. He was 10 years old when a black stallion was brought before his father's court, a massive, wild-eyed horse that had thrown every rider who attempted to mount it. Trainers had failed. Soldiers had failed. Philip was about to send the animal away. The boy walked forward, turned the horse to face the sun so its own shadow would not frighten it, spoke softly to its ear, and rode it across the field without a stumble. The horse's name was Bucephalus. Alexander would ride him into every battle for the next 20 years, until the animal died of wounds in India and Alexander named a city after him. That was Alexander. He saw what others missed. He did what others declared impossible. He turned fear into forward motion. By contrast, Darius III enters history through retreat. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, when Alexander's smaller army outmaneuvered the massive Persian force on a narrow coastal plain, Darius abandoned his battle chariot and fled on horseback, leaving behind his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his treasury. A king who fled. Alexander, to his credit, treated the captured Persian royal women with complete dignity. He sent word to Darius's mother. She had nothing to fear. Reportedly, she wept not for her son, but because Alexander had shown more honor than the man she called king. 3 tiers of stakes pressed on this campaign. Personally, Alexander carried the weight of a murdered father and a court that doubted him. He had to prove, every single day, that he was more than Philip's son. Nationally, Macedonia was small, and small kingdoms do not survive in an ancient world of giants unless they expand. And civilizationally, though, Alexander could not have named it in those terms. The question was whether Greek thought, Greek philosophy, Greek art and architecture, Greek ways of asking questions about the world, would survive and spread beyond the narrow peninsula where they were born. We should name our sources and their limits. The historians we rely on: Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus of Sicily, Quintus Curtius wrote between 300 and 500 years after the events they described. They drew on earlier accounts, many now lost. Arrian is generally considered the most reliable, Plutarch the most vivid, Diodorus the most suspicious of conspiracy. All of them had agendas. All of them were writing about a man who had already become legend. We cannot take any single account as gospel. What we can do is triangulate, find the points where the stories agree, and let the overlaps speak. They agree on one thing above all else. Alexander the Great died too young, too suddenly, and under circumstances that have never been fully explained. 13 years. That is how long Alexander campaigned. To understand his death, you must feel the weight of those 13 years pressing down on the man in that Babylonian bed. This was not a king who sat on a throne and dispatched armies. This was a soldier who fought at the front of every charge, who took a sword slash to the head, a catapult bolt to the shoulder, an arrow through his lung in India that nearly killed him on the spot. His body was a map of wounds. His army was held together by his presence literally, physically, personally, and every year of campaign left more scar tissue, more damage, more cost. The machine of Alexander's army was extraordinary. At its core stood the Macedonian phalanx, dense formations of infantry armed with the sarissa, a pike nearly 6 meters long. When a phalanx locked into position, it presented a wall of overlapping spear points that no cavalry charge could simply ride through. But the phalanx was not Alexander's killing stroke. That was his companion cavalry, the heteroi heavy horsemen in bronze, riding in a wedge formation directly at the hinge point of an enemy line. The phalanx pinned the enemy. The cavalry broke it. Again and again, that combination worked. At the Battle of Granicus in 334 BC, Alexander crossed into Persian territory with approximately 47,000 men and shattered the Persian satraps waiting for him on the eastern bank of a river. He crossed into enemy territory and fought while his generals begged him to wait. He led the charge himself. He nearly died. A Persian officer's axe came within inches of his skull before a bodyguard intervened. The Persian defense collapsed. At Issus in 333 BC, Darius brought an army that outnumbered Alexander's force by a ratio some ancient sources place at 3-1. He chose a narrow coastal plain, thinking to negate Alexander's cavalry advantage. But Alexander saw the gap between the Persian center and the mountains. He drove his cavalry directly at Darius. The Persian king broke and ran, and with that flight, the psychological backbone of Persian resistance cracked. At Gaugamela, in 331 BC, the open plains of what is now northern Iraq, Darius had prepared the ground. He had the field leveled for his war chariots. He deployed war elephants, scythe-wheeled chariots, and an army that ancient sources number in the hundreds of thousands, though modern estimates are more conservative. Alexander began the battle by drifting his entire formation obliquely to the right, drawing the Persian line into a stretched pursuit, then drove his companions like a spear into the gap that opened in the Persian center. Darius fled again. The Achaemenid Empire, 200 years of Persian power, was over in an afternoon. What followed Gaugamela was not triumph. It was revelation, and not the comfortable kind. Alexander burned Persepolis, the spiritual capital of the Persian world, possibly in a moment of calculated political theater, possibly in a night of drunken rage. Accounts differ. He marched into Bactria and Sogdiana, the wild northeastern edge of the Persian world, and spent 3 grinding years fighting a guerrilla war against enemies who would not stand in a line and be defeated properly. He married Roxana, a Bactrian noble girl, which scandalized his Macedonian officers. Then India. The Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC against King Porus. Porus was 7 feet tall by ancient account, rode his war elephant with calm authority, and fought even after his army broke. Alexander was so moved that he made him an ally and returned his kingdom. He named a city after Bucephalus, who died of wounds after the battle. But at the Bees River, the campaign stopped. The army refused to go further. They had marched for 10 years. They had crossed deserts and mountain ranges and monsoon rivers. They had fought men and beasts and terrain and heat and cold and disease. They wanted to go home. Alexander, the man who had never accepted the word impossible, stood before his veterans and wept. It may be the most human moment in his story. The conqueror, begging his soldiers for more. They would not move. He turned back, and something in him, those who knew him said, turned with it. He began drinking more. His closest friend Hephaestion, the one person he seemed to love without reservation, without political calculation, died in Ecbatana in 324 BC from what may have been illness or poisoning. Alexander's grief was operatic, catastrophic, the grief of a man who had kept himself invincible by having one person who saw through all of it. He ordered a state funeral that consumed a fortune. He ordered a period of mourning across the empire. Plutarch says he lay beside the body for a day and night, refusing to leave. He arrived in Babylon in the spring of 323 BC, planning an invasion of Arabia. The Chaldean priests warned him not to enter the city. Their deity, Bel, had told them it would be fatal. Alexander attempted to obey the warning. He tried to enter from a different direction. The terrain forced him back to the standard approach. He entered Babylon. The last banquet began. Phase 1. The last night. Day 1. The evening of late May, 323 BC, smells of roasting meat and river water and the sweet darkness of Babylonian wine. Admiral Nearchus has thrown the banquet, a celebration of the coming Arabian campaign, the next great conquest already gleaming in Alexander's imagination. The hall echoes with the noise of men who have survived impossible things together, soldiers, officers, veterans of Gaugamela and Hydaspes, and 100 smaller engagements whose names history never bothered to remember. Alexander drinks. This is not unusual. He has always drunk, and the years since India have made the wine arrive earlier and stay longer. But tonight is different. Tonight, Medius of Larissa, one of his officers, invites him to continue the celebration at a second gathering. Alexander goes. The lamps burn low. The wine moves in great craters, wide-mouthed vessels that hold 6 quarts of mixed wine and water, the kind that is not meant for one man. Then it happens. He stops mid-drink, sets the cup down with a clatter that cuts through the noise. His face changes, something behind his eyes shifting, a light going sideways. He cries out. The sound that leaves him is not a warrior's shout. It is a man blindsided by pain, a sudden eruption of agony spreading from his abdomen, radiating up his back like a spear has been driven through him from the inside. He is helped to his feet. He is carried to his chamber. No one knows it yet. But the greatest conqueror in the history of the world has just fought his last battle. Phase 2. The fever takes hold. Days 2-6. By the second morning the fever has arrived like an occupying army, systematic and total. His temperature climbs. His skin runs slick with sweat despite the heat that already saturates Babylon in early June. He calls for water, and more water, and cannot quench the thirst, no matter how much he drinks, a raging, burning thirst that the wine had perhaps begun, but nothing now could end. The back pain intensifies. He describes it. Those who were present would later record, like being stabbed continuously between the shoulder blades, a blade that does not withdraw. He orders his physicians summoned. They come, examine, confer in low voices at the doorway. Ancient medicine, even at its most sophisticated, and Alexander had some of the best physicians in the world at his disposal, can do little for a fever of this magnitude. They bleed him. They apply poultices. They pray. He continues to give orders from his bed. On the third day he is moved to the palace garden, where the air moves more freely. He receives visitors. He speaks with his senior officers about the Arabian campaign, the ships already being built, the routes already being scouted. His mind is clear. This is crucial, and we will return to it. His mind remains entirely clear throughout these days, while his body systematically fails him. But by the 5th day, standing has become impossible without assistance. He manages the short distance to the ritual bath with 2 officers supporting his weight. He performs the required sacrifices even now, even burning with fever. He will not neglect the gods. The soldiers watching from a distance see a silhouette diminished from the one they remember. Rumors begin moving through the camp with the speed of plague. The king is dying. The king was poisoned. The king is already dead, and the generals are hiding it. Men who had stormed the walls of Tyre and crossed the Hindu Kush, standing to their knees in snow, begin to weep openly in the lanes between tents. Phase 3. The final assembly. Days 7-10. On the 7th day, Alexander makes a decision that will echo through the ages. He orders the common soldiers admitted to see him. Not the generals, not the court. The soldiers, the men who had marched with him for a decade, who had buried their comrades from the Granicus to the Ganges, who had stood in the Macedonian phalanx and held the line when everything depended on holding it. They are permitted to file past their king, one by one, through the dim chamber where he lies. He cannot speak to them anymore. He can barely move, but he can see them. And as each man passes, each weathered, scar-marked face, each soldier who had once been a young man leaving Macedonia for the first and possibly last time, Alexander raises his hand and waves. A small motion. A gesture. It is the most it costs him to give, and he gives it to every single one of them. Some weep. Some do not. Some stand at the foot of his bed for a moment too long, as if trying to memorize the image, before the men behind them urge them forward. It takes hours. He waves at every one of them. By day 9, the ability to speak is gone. The fever has climbed beyond anything his physicians can pretend to manage. His officers crowd around the bed. The question that no one wants to ask fills the room like a physical weight. Perdiccas, one of the senior commanders, finally voices it. He presses Alexander's ring, the royal seal of Macedonia and the empire, into his king's hand, and asks, "To whom do you leave the empire?" Alexander's lips move. Those close enough to hear report these words. "To the strongest." It may have been a practical answer. It may have been despair. It may have been a final joke from a man who had always appreciated the brutal honesty of strength. It may have been something else, entirely a whisper so faint that it was misheard, misremembered, reshaped in the retelling by men who needed the story to mean something. 3 words. The largest empire in the ancient world. No further instruction. His hand still holds the ring. Phase 4. The silence. Days 11-12. The breathing becomes shallow, then shallower still. The chamber goes quiet in a way that is different from ordinary silence, a silence with mass, with presence, with the particular weight that settles over a room when something enormous is ending. On the evening of June 10, or the morning of June 11, the ancient sources differ by hours. Alexander III of Macedonia stops breathing. He is 32 years old. The Macedonians wail. The Babylonian citizens shave their heads in mourning. The local custom for the death of a great king. A horseman rides through the night toward the far edges of the empire to carry the news that would crack the ancient world along every seam. And then the strangest thing happens. His body does not decay. 6 days pass. His skin does not discolor. The smell of death does not come. The ancient world's most unmistakable biological signal, the transformation that begins within hours of death, simply does not occur. To the soldiers and citizens of Babylon, to the priests and physicians and generals gathered around the body, there is only one explanation. He is a ghost. 6 days. No decay. No answers. Modern medicine offers a different possibility, one that is almost more astonishing. Dr. Catherine Hall of the University of Otago proposed in 2018 that Alexander may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder in which the immune system attacks the nervous system, causing progressive paralysis that ascends from the extremities toward the core. The variant she identifies would have preserved his mental clarity while paralyzing his body. His breathing would have become so shallow, so minimal, that ancient physicians who relied on visible chest movement to confirm death would have seen nothing. The decreasing oxygen demands of a body shutting down would have slowed decomposition. Alexander the Great, she argues, may have spent 6 days being buried alive, or very nearly so. His body recognized no motion, made no sound, offered no protest. He had, perhaps, one final thing in common with his empire: the appearance of life, long after the life had gone. The empire Alexander left behind had no instructions. He had named no successor. His wife Roxana was pregnant. A son, Alexander IV, would be born after his father's death, but a child in the womb is not a king, and in the ancient world, a king in the womb is an invitation for every ambitious general within 1,000 miles. His other wife, Statira, daughter of Darius III, was murdered within weeks, reportedly on Roxana's orders. The first consequence of Alexander's death was grief so total it became political. Sisygambis, the mother of Darius III, the woman Alexander had treated with such dignity that she came to regard him as a son, received word of his death and refused to eat. She did not rage. She did not weep, or at least that is not what the sources record. She simply stopped. She died of voluntary starvation within days. Following the man she had once called her captor into the dark, the generals began circling before the body was cold. Perdiccas claimed the role of regent. Ptolemy argued for a council. Antigonus maneuvered for Asia. Within a year, the wars of the Diadochi, the wars of the successors, had consumed the empire that took 13 years to build. Alexander's mother Olympias, his generals, his wives, and eventually his son would all die violently in the decades that followed. Roxana and Alexander IV were assassinated in 310 BC. The last direct connection to the bloodline, erased. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar stood empty. The torches in the hall were extinguished. The maps on the walls still showed the empire's boundaries from Greece to northwestern India, from the Black Sea to the Egyptian desert, but the hands that had drawn those lines with armies were still and cold. The battlefield, in this case, was an empty room, an unoccupied throne, a ring passed to no one and then argued over by everyone. The cause of death remains officially unresolved. Theories cluster in 2 groups. Disease theories include malaria, typhoid fever, West Nile encephalitis, and Guillain-Barré syndrome. Poisoning theories name Veratrum album, white hellebore, as the most pharmacologically plausible agent, one whose prolonged, agonizing course matches the ancient accounts precisely. The waters of the river Styx, which ancient sources describe as corrosive and deadly, have also been proposed. Arsenic poisoning, aconite, strychnine. Every century adds a new suspect and a new method. The one thing all theories share: a 32-year-old body, already battered by a decade of wounds, facing something it could not fight. His generals could not save him. His physicians could not diagnose him. His gods, Zeus, Ammon, the divine lineage he half believed and half performed, did not intervene. The room simply went quiet. Alexander died without naming a successor, and so his empire became what empires without successors always become: a contest. Within 50 years, the single vast domain was 3 separate kingdoms. Ptolemy took Egypt and founded a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra, another brilliant, multilingual ruler of a cosmopolitan Mediterranean world, surrendered it to Rome in 30 BC. Seleucus took the eastern territories, stretching from Syria to Bactria, and built a kingdom where Greek and Persian culture fused into something neither culture could have produced alone. Antigonus and his descendants took Macedonia and Greece, and spent generations fighting the others. Out of that fracture came something unexpected: the Hellenistic world. Greek language became the common tongue of educated people from Alexandria to Antioch to the foothills of Afghanistan. Greek philosophy traveled east and encountered Buddhist thought in Gandhara, producing a tradition, Greco-Buddhism, in which the first human images of the Buddha were sculpted in a distinctly Greek style, the robes of a Macedonian philosopher draped over an Indian sage. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the city Alexander, named after himself in Egypt, became the greatest repository of human knowledge in the ancient world, the place where Euclid wrote geometry, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth, and Archimedes dreamed of levers long enough to move the world. None of that happens without Alexander's conquests. None of it happens without his death triggering the dispersal that spread those seeds. He changed warfare permanently, the coordinated use of cavalry and infantry in flexible combined arms tactics that he refined and perfected would influence military doctrine for centuries. He demonstrated that large empires could be administered across vast distances and diverse cultures, a lesson that Rome absorbed and institutionalized. He proved, by example, that the borders of the known world were not fixed, that a determined mind, backed by a disciplined army, could reach the edge of the map and look over. But the deepest legacy of Alexander the Great is not military and not political. It is the question his death leaves unanswered. The man who conquered everything could not conquer the thing that finally took him. Not a Persian king, not an Indian army, not a mountain range, or a desert, or a river in flood, something far smaller. A fever, a banquet, a cup of wine at the wrong table with the wrong host, or perhaps just a body that had simply given everything it had and had nothing left to give. He had spent his life proving that limits were illusions. He died proving they were real. Centuries later, the ruins of Babylon lie in present-day Iraq, south of Baghdad, mounds of compressed history, baked brick and dust, the outlines of what was once the greatest city in the ancient world, barely legible beneath the surface. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar, where Alexander spent his final days, has been excavated and partially reconstructed, its foundations exposed to the same desert sun that burned above him in June 323 BC. The exact room where he died is not marked. The exact cause of his death is not resolved. The exact words he whispered to the strongest, or something else entirely, are not confirmed. What remains is the shape of what he did. An empire built in 13 years that no single person ever held again. A name that became a standard against which every general, every king, every conqueror for the next 2,000 years measured themselves and fell short. He conquered everything, except the one enemy that needed no army, no sword, no plan, only time. And in the end, as in the beginning, the Babylonian night was still and dark and full of questions, and the man who might have answered them was silent.